All right. Well, welcome back everyone to the second half of our research symposium for today. Our next speaker is Professor Jennifer Haverkamp. She is the Professor of Practice at Michigan Law and the Graham Family Director of the University of Michigan Graham Sustainability Institute. She co-chaired the U of M President Mark Schleisel's Commission on Carbon Neutrality, a 17-member commission charged with recommending a timeline and pathway for achieving that goal. The commission has come forth with ambitious goals and detailed strategies covering scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions from the Ann Arbor, Dearborn, and Flint campuses and the university's medical center complex. Today, Professor Haverkamp will describe the Commission's research-intensive and publicly engaged process, its key recommendations, and some initial implementation steps for the university. Please join me in welcoming Professor Haverkamp. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to have been invited to join you today, and having had the pleasure of hearing Peter Burns' opening presentation, I really see how what I'm going to talk about can perhaps fit in with what Notre Dame has been doing. I think there are things we can learn from you, and also things where we hope that we're learning some lessons that can be shared by other institutions like ourselves. I have some slides, and so I will share my screen and hope that everyone can see that. All right, is that visible?
Yes, if you could just put it in presenter mode.
Very good. Hang on a sec. How's that?
Very good.
Okay, fantastic. All right, well, again, as I said, it's my great pleasure to be with you today to talk about the work of our Carbon Neutrality Commission and the next steps that President Schlissel has already announced in implementing it. So this commission was set up in February of 2019, so 2 years ago, and given this charge to contribute to a more sustainable and just world by creating approaches and solutions regarding the university's carbon emissions that are environmentally sustainable, involve the regional community, and create scalable and transferable models. And that latter phrase, I think, was especially important, recognizing that one university going to carbon neutrality doesn't solve the problem. It's only if the things we do can be shared elsewhere, taken up elsewhere to have a broader impact. I think probably everyone on this symposium knows what carbon neutrality is, but for an institute like the University of Michigan, we're interpreting it to mean that all of our quantifiable greenhouse gas emissions attributable to our activities are eliminated or offset by investments in carbon credits or sequestration projects. The purpose and objectives of our commission, we were, as I think I don't need to go over this because I think that Ginger covered that basically in our goal, the goal and parameters of carbon neutrality, the timeline, pathways, and approaches for doing so. So I want to dwell a minute on this because we had quite an elaborate structure and approached this in a very inclusive and rigorous process. What this slide shows is the commission, which I co-chaired there in the center. My co-chair was Professor Stephen Forrest, an engineering professor who'd been at the university many years. We had 17 members of our commission, which included not only university faculty, administrators, and facilities people, campus sustainability people, but we also included, by the president's choice, representatives of the two large utilities in the state of Michigan, Consumers and DTE, and also representative of the city of Ann Arbor and environmental NGO, the head of League of Conservation Voters for the state of Michigan. He wanted to have everyone around the table at the same time, or not everyone, but representatives of the key stakeholders around the table at the same time. We had quite a network of advisors. We had a process of public sessions to engage the campus community. And then we, knowing the 17 of us ourselves didn't have the full expertise to develop these recommendations, we relied on internal and external analysis to bring recommendations and information forward to our commission. The internal analysis teams were led by faculty. They included teams of students to conduct the research. The slide there shows the subject matter of each of those analysis teams. Things like building standards, biosequestration, commuting, food, electrification of our buses, and other mobility. We involved external consultants. Most significantly, and probably the most costly piece of this, was an organization called the Integral Group was hired to do a analysis of how we could bring our heat and power infrastructure to carbon neutrality using currently available technologies. Overall, throughout this process, we involved probably over 100 people in this work, developing what turned out to be 50 recommendations. People on this symposium are probably familiar with scopes 1, 2, and 3, that terminology for emissions. But very briefly, scope 1 means what we generate ourselves as a university through our power plant, our boilers, our buses, and other transportation. Scope 2 is our purchased electricity. And scope 3 is everything else attributable to the university through activities. It's the emissions made in the food that's produced or the computers that we purchase. It's all of the external things that's very difficult to measure and difficult to control. This grid shows the approach that we took in analyzing what we ought to include in our scope and how to cover it. As you can see from bottom to top is our ability to confidently estimate the emission levels. And the x-axis is our ability to directly influence the emission levels from high to low. So where we had the most control was obviously our power plant, our own emissions, our boilers. Where we had the least control is some of those scope 3 emission categories I was talking about, like general purchasing, food purchasing. This slide, I think, helps explain the big conundrum that we and universities similarly situated face, which is for our scope 1 emissions, those we generate ourselves. For the University of Michigan, 98% of those are from natural gas, mostly from our central power plant and the other boilers that we have on our 3 campuses. Only 2% of our emissions come from transportation fuels. So even though electric buses are very visible, they are not a big piece of our carbon footprint. Much like what I was hearing about Notre Dame's power plant, of our natural gas usage, 65% of that comes from one central power plant, the rest from facilities on other campuses in our system. And of that, what is the use to that natural gas? 72% of it is heat, 23% electricity, 5% process steam. So you cannot go carbon neutral with the central power plant simply by purchasing more electricity when you have, as Notre Dame and Michigan do, an elaborate system of steam tunnels connected through district heating system. So after these 2 years, in March of this year, we issued our report. I should also say that part of our process was to put out first, last December, a draft of our report and all of our recommendations, and to invite public comment on them. We got over 500 public comments, and so much of February and March were spent working through those public comments and making revisions as the commission considered appropriate. I'd like to go through some of the key recommendations with you. First, for our scope 1 emissions, the ones that we produce ourselves, we recommended that the university commit to carbon neutrality by 2025, recognizing that to do so would require the use of offsets. So inclusive of offsets by 2025. And this was motivated in significant part by a sense of urgency, a sense that large universities like ourselves were better positioned than many entities around the world to make contributions in this area, and that purchasing offsets would get us there faster. It was not, however, without controversy, as I'll get to later. We basically had two goals for Scope 1. The first one of 2025 is with offsets, but we also set a goal for emission reductions without offsets. In other words, genuine carbon neutrality for Scope 1 emissions by 2040. And not to just get to 2040 and do that, but to also have appropriate reductions along the way consistent with the IPCC recommendations and other science-based targets so that we make significant reductions, say by 2030. For our Scope 2 emissions, that seemed fairly easy to do power purchase agreements for renewable power. So we also recommended that we could commit to carbon neutrality for Scope 2 for all three of our campuses by 2025 or earlier. This graphic shows our Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions and the trajectory that our recommendations would take you on. Black are the Scope 2 purchased electricity, where that could be taken neutral by 2025. The blue is Scope 1, that would be gradual. The stair stepping that you see is in part reductions that our electric utilities have already committed to, as well as our own reductions that we expect to make along the way. The green area under the line is what would be required offset-wise to achieve these goals. So with each of these recommendations, we didn't just set a goal date, but also developed strategy recommendations for how to get there. And the big conundrum of the central power plant, our consultants came back recommending that the way to get there that made the most sense was a massive district level geo-exchange system. So similar to some of the geothermal that you're implementing, but this would be a 20-year process over all of our campuses to get there. And the price tag is high, $3.5 billion. The idea of what made us comfortable including this recommendation was the idea that there will be other innovations developed along the way that would make this both cheaper and provide alternatives to geo-exchange. As far as our transportation emissions, we recommended fully decarbonizing, for instance, by going to electric vehicles, electric buses and trucks. For Scope 2, as I mentioned, we thought we could get there pretty quickly with purchased electricity by issuing an RFP. We have already taken half of the university's purchased electricity to neutrality through 100% renewable purchase from DPE for the Ann Arbor campus. And that was with wind power. As you all will appreciate, you don't want to just take the supply neutral, but also to reduce the demand. We recommended that the university create a revolving energy fund on each of our three campuses where university units, schools and colleges could borrow from the fund to implement energy efficiency projects, for instance, and the revenue from those savings go back into the fund. Also, we proposed implementing a carbon pricing system across the whole university, and those revenues would also go into the revolving energy fund. And then for building standards, new best-in-class building standards for all the new construction and major renovations. For Scope 3, the purchased goods and other off-site sources of emissions. As I noted earlier, those are difficult to measure, and so our recommendations centered first more around better accounting to get a clear understanding of the amount of emissions in that area, because you can't reduce them to neutrality if you don't know how many you're emitting. So we recommended to set goal dates for each of our Scope 3 categories by 2025, along with recommendations for accounting. And also that we, for each of these goal dates, the ultimate goal of neutrality for scope 3 would be no later than 2040, recognizing that in some areas you might also, again, need to use offsets, such as emission reductions from air travel. And then for scope 3, I won't go into a lot of detail on these, but this is part of our 50 recommendations. We had detailed recommendations across many, many categories. These came out of these faculty-led research groups. So we had a lot of detailed recommendations about reforming the parking policy and changing the incentive structure around commuting, pushing for more carpooling, for more public transportation, working with the city of Ann Arbor, charging stations for electric vehicles, that sort of thing, a lot in the commuting area. Then we had recommendations for changing the incentives around university travel so that people didn't fly short distances, to do more video conferencing, which COVID has taught us all how to do much better. On food, there's been a lot of progress already in university dining in terms of going to more plant-forward diets, given the high carbon footprint of certain food choices, but to do it through education, incentives, and increased options, not through mandating things. We discovered that, for instance, Meatless Mondays meant an awful lot of students just ate off campus in the local restaurants. We also put some focus on our leased buildings and how to create incentives for the landlords of those buildings to improve the greenhouse gas emissions performance of those buildings, et cetera. There are a lot more. Anyway, I mentioned that offsets were somewhat controversial, both outside and within our commission. That was one of the areas where we got the widest range of public comments, from any use of offsets is immoral to the university needs to go carbon neutral as quickly as possible. So you should go out on the market and buy the cheapest offsets possible, and you can be carbon neutral tomorrow. So I know you've got a speaker later that will talk more about offsets. I'm really interested in what she has to say, but we came up with a set of recommendations on offsets. Fair number will look familiar to people familiar with offsets in terms of how to have credible, measurable, additional permanent offsets, but also a focus on co-benefits, focus on looking for ways to do more biosequestration on university-owned properties, and then recognizing how much this field is changing. We recommended the establishment of an advisory committee to provide the university with guidance on offsets, including the types of projects that could be done locally, regionally, and very importantly, how to ensure that this kind of work was done with clear understanding of the environmental justice implications and with environmental justice expertise on that committee. So those were our recommendations submitted to President Schlissel in mid-March, and just a couple of weeks ago on May 20th, at a meeting with the university regents, he announced his initial steps for implementation. And very gratifying to the commission how many of our recommendations he has already accepted. Also, notably, he has taken none off the table so far. And just very quickly to highlight a few of those, he has committed to eliminate Scope 1 emissions by 2040 for the university, and is going to do some initial pilot projects with the GeoExchange to work toward a phased-in transition of those systems. He's committed to electrifying the buses and launching the Revolving Energy Fund, beginning with the $25 million fund. Committed to achieve carbon neutrality for Scope 2, the purchased electricity, by 2025, and is in the process of developing an RFP for that. And also accepted the recommendation for establishing net zero goals for Scope 3 emissions by 2025. Wants to study the use of carbon offsets more closely, so no decision there. I think especially important for one of the themes of this conference, which is sort of how to engage the community, the structure, how to make this really happen. One of our key recommendations for organization for the university was to create a new executive level leader reporting to the president to oversee the carbon neutrality efforts university-wide. And that's because it wasn't just a facilities and operations role, and it wasn't just a role under the provost for the academic side, but really someone who had to be able to work across both. We also, he's accepted that environmental justice principles need to be incorporated into decision-making. He's committed to appoint the internal committee and an external committee that we recommended, a community advisory council, to bring those external voices into the process. And then another recommendation he's agreed to is to initiate a campus master planning process that centers carbon neutrality. So as we think about new buildings, do we really need a new building? Where do we put it? How do we structure the campuses so that we reduce the need for, say, more transportation to and from? How do we reuse the structures that we have? All that sort of thing. External collaboration, more engagement with surrounding communities, research and education. Again, as far as how to make all this scalable and transferable, we recommended really upping the university's research profile in areas of climate and energy and their commitments in this area. He already initiated a carbon neutrality acceleration program of faculty research that my institute runs. We're also have a recommendation that he's accepted to look for opportunities to integrate sustainability and carbon neutrality more into the core curricula across the university. We like to say that one of the most important products of this work would be to graduate every student with a clear understanding of the importance of climate change and going forth to make sure that that's a priority in their lives and to take the message out to others. Another thing that was happening in parallel with my commission, but was announced in mid-March as well, late March, was that the university's regents have just announced a new natural resources investment policy, which notably commits the university to a net zero endowment, aiming to do so by 2040, to discontinue our direct investments into the 200 publicly traded companies that are the largest greenhouse gas contributors, and shifting natural resource investment focus to renewable energy investments, and discontinuing investments in funds primarily focused on oil and thermal coal, and public reports to the regents on progress toward that commitment. And that I covered a lot. Sorry to go so fast, but I look forward to your comments and your questions.
All right, thank you very much. We'll welcome questions from the audience. So what partnerships for offsets are, let's see, what partnerships for offsets non-U of M lands have been explored so far?
Well, as I mentioned, the president has just announced his commitments 2 weeks ago. So I think it's fair to say that the university formally has not explored such partnerships yet. There are some examples of other institutions in the state, like some of the companies in the state that are working with the Nature Conservancy on some of the forest lands. I know there's, with respect to at least purchased electricity offsets, no, I wouldn't call those offsets, but for RECs, for purchased electricity, some people are interested in the MIT model of investing in, say, solar or wind out of state. I have my own questions about that as a strategy for the University of Michigan, but there's just a big debate, I think, that needs to be sorted through about how much you prioritize your own local offsets, right? Whether your offset projects should be local or whether you go to the broad carbon market, whether you focus on natural resource offsets or other kinds of offsets. I do know that there are much more sort of co-benefits from a local offsets project, but Duke University, which does that, we talked to them about the price per ton of their projects, and they're not surprisingly very expensive. They do contribute to the educational co-benefit as well as working with local communities and being sure that you're addressing the justice dimensions, but but there's also a trade-off with price.
So you talked a lot about how hard it is to calculate Scope 3 emissions. Is there a standard across universities so that everyone is trying to tally up, the same Scope 3 emissions so that one school doesn't look extremely high just because another school's not counting that? Can you talk about that a minute?
Well, different schools who are setting carbon neutrality goals are approaching Scope 3 emissions differently. And I don't have it in front of me, but we put a chart in our report that showed among a number of key schools which had committed to include Scope 3 emissions in their goals and by when, if they'd set a date yet. But it's an area where there's still a lot more, I think, information and sharing and coordination that ought to be done. I also know that the accounting questions around Scope 3 are not limited to universities, but all of the major companies that are setting their own carbon neutrality goals, many of them are also trying to include Scope 3 in their goals. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity there for sharing accounting methods. When we have a whole unit on campus that does an awful lot of life cycle analysis and carbon accounting, and they just felt like the error bars on Scope 3 emissions were so great that we couldn't even say whether the Scope 3 emissions totaled more than all of our Scope 1 and 2 combined. They're out there.
Yeah. So you said there were over 500 public comments. Can you tell us about the breakdown of who or what types of sectors those comments came from?
Probably not very accurately. I haven't looked at it lately, but our comments came from faculty, from students, from facilities people, from the external community. There are a certain number of the comments that were like a certain student group had a set of objectives that they wanted us to pay attention to, and they got a lot of their members to submit the same comments. And so there was some repetition across them, but there were still, not only 500 different commenters, but something like 500 different comments despite that. As I mentioned, a lot of them were around offsets. A lot of them were around wanting us in the final report to bring more of an environmental justice lens to our recommendations, which we then worked to improve. There are a lot of specific recommendations in that Scope 3 world that people had their own ideas about ways that we could improve things. A lot of the comments were seeking clarification. It just ran the gamut.
And so the next question is about the Revolving Fund for Energy Efficiency Projects. What kind of projects would you expect to see, and at what level would these projects be done? Are they on the department level, in the dorms, by building? And would they be suggested by committees within units or from individuals?
So there's what our recommendations had in mind, and then there's what the university will actually implement, which I need to make that distinction. There is, if you look at our report, one of the appendices is the detailed recommendations from the internal analysis team on economic measures that recommended the revolving fund, and they went into a lot of detail about how they thought it could be structured. What I can say is, similar to Notre Dame, we have had for maybe a decade or more projects to look for the low-hanging fruit in energy efficiency, and a fair number of them have been implemented. The $25 million amount was recommended by this faculty research team based on where they thought efficiency improvements would still pay for themselves, and before you got to the point where the cost of the retrofit or the renovation was way more than the payback. The University of Michigan is very decentralized, and so we anticipate that the deans of the schools and colleges will be the ones who oversee what their unit's proposal to the fund would be.
So I guess it's unique that you do have multiple campuses. So what are the different struggles that you see by trying to get all of the 3 campuses to the same standards?
You know, that is a great question, and it's one that I think also has bearing on some of the themes of equity that we've been talking about, because the Ann Arbor and Flint and Dearborn campuses have different levels of resources, different student profile of their student populations, different needs. Like Ann Arbor has the huge medical complex, which is part of the carbon footprint. Flint is almost 100% a commuter campus. And so their carbon footprint is, you know, a lot around commuting, but the students have to be able to get to and from campus in a place that doesn't have a great public transportation network at the moment. The recommendations of our report were very much that the university needed to approach this at a centralized level to provide the resources to all 3 campuses. The chancellors of Dearborn and Flint are excited about this initiative and working with the cities of Dearborn and Flint on the kinds of collaborations needed to really make it happen. So it's somewhat new for Flint and Dearborn, because Ann Arbor had already a greenhouse gas reduction goal of set in 2011. So it's been working toward that already. So there's a bit of a catch up that Dearborn and Flint are going through, but enthusiastically.
Awesome. And then one last question, just to kind of a follow up to that, is are there student involvement on the Flint and Dearborn campuses as well?
There are, and I was pleased that we had some students from Dearborn and Flint as members of those internal analysis teams. And actually the biosequestration analysis team was led by Flint faculty. And one of the advisory structures we had was a student advisory panel, which included students from Dearborn and Flint on it as well. So we're bringing students from all 3 campuses together for some of that. And one of the recommendations President Schlissel has adopted is to extend to Dearborn and Flint one of our sustainability programs for students, faculty, and staff. So hopefully there'll be a lot more engagement.
All right. Well, if there are no other questions from the audience, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us today. It was really awesome to learn about what U of M is doing.
Thank you so very much. I look forward to the other presentations either today or when I can watch them later. Thanks.
All right.